Hello everyone, welcome back to the return of the Grim Dawn class examinations. I'm starting with the Paladin simply because the last time I did the Paladin I made some errors with some skills. And also, Sweet Meteor O... I can't quite remember. The last Sweet Meteor O Death or Doom? I can't quite remember. Your username will be in the description below. I can't remember off the top of my head right now, I apologize, but Sweet Meteor did say that I could be more specific as well with these, so let's get right into it. Now, I'm actually going to do this in a bit of a different way, and I'm going to talk about my favorite improv builds here. Again, this is not going to be talking about equipment. I'm going to make a part 2 where I talk about specific equipment, but for now I just want to talk about the skills. I'll culminate this into a 3-part series talking about a complete package, my favorite complete builds, etc. But for improv, these are my 4 favorites. Now, when I improv a Paladin, I'm going for one of 4 builds, and I term them around the weapons that I primarily use with them. The first one is two-handed ranged. Now, I'm going to surprise you all and admit that I almost never dual-wield pistols with a Paladin. At least not when I improv. And even then, even when I'm not improving, my planned builds don't usually go with dual-wielding pistols either. But for the two-handed ranged weapon, we still want ranged expertise, and we want bursting round. I pretty much always build these, regardless of the situation, just because they're free, they increase your damage, it's really magnificent. Now, I usually will also go with Righteous Fervor, because obviously two-handed ranged weapon, you've got all this damage you're doing, it's just a magical time. I'll usually also culminate with Divine Mandate. The reason why I culminate with Divine Mandate here instead of either Aura of Conviction or Aura of Censure is because both of those require you to be within a certain range. Well, okay, Aura of Conviction doesn't. Just boosts your physical and internal trauma damage and your pierce. However, personally, I prefer the fire damage boost from Divine Mandate, especially since you're using Righteous Fervor, so it actually does more for you. And even though your gun probably does pierce damage, there are a lot of guns out there that do fire damage instead of physical and pierce, so you're not necessarily guaranteed to have pierce damage either. So I personally have found, through personal experimentation, that Divine Mandate is generally better for a two-handed ranged build, but if you prefer Aura of Conviction, that is also a viable option. I have used Aura of Conviction before with this, and it is also effective. It's just more of the physical side of the damage than the fire side, but, you know, when you're playing a Paladin, why not take advantage of the fire damage? Now, as you probably noticed, I sometimes build Deadly Aim because obviously it's primarily heavy regular attack, you know, the regular auto attacks. And for two-handed ranged, I'll also usually build Rune of Callistor. And I build Rune of Callistor and max out Ignition for 2 reasons. First, it does fire and physical damage, which you're already boosting. Second, Ignition gives you a nice stun chance, well, not even a stun chance, but a nice stun on this as well. So while you're shooting at the enemy, or if you see enemies in the distance, you can throw down a whole bunch of runes and then start shooting away, and then the enemy will be stunned as they run into the ruins, which is of great help to you. And I just generally find this to be very effective, for me personally, at the very least. Now, besides that, what you use or what you continue on with is really up to you. I usually will go for Word of Renewal. Sometimes I'll go up to Steel Resolve, not usually. It really depends on how much you really want to increase the internal trauma damage of Retribution, how much you want to increase your overall Righteous Fervor damage. If you were to go all the way with Steel Resolve, you go up to here. I usually use Resilience, and I'll put some into Ascension for when enemies do get into melee with you, because it is going to happen, let's be really honest. But usually, for me at the very least, I'm not necessarily going to use Steel Resolve. I just am not the biggest fan of it, at least with this setup. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't. It really depends on what items I have. If I have an item that boosts Word of Renewal, yeah, I'll run for it. I usually use Word of Arms, I did forget to mention that, just because, mostly for the minus 6 second skill recharge, that's really the main reason. You don't need a ton of energy regeneration with this particular improv build. Maybe early on, I'll need the energy regeneration, but it's not very often. And furthermore, I'll usually use Ascension here. And you don't have to necessarily use Ascension. I don't usually go for Clarity of Purpose for reference. This is just way too expensive for some stuff that you don't really necessarily need. I will do what I do as a spot change, is what I call it, where I'll switch out one of my other points for clarity of purpose, specifically to fight specific bosses. The Mad Queen Rashalka, I think her name is, she's one of those bosses that I'll do this with, because that 100% life leech resistance is very important when fighting her. So I'll use that against, very specific enemies. But generally speaking, I don't use this. This isn't something that I have on all the time. I just wanted to mention that here because a lot of people forget clarity of purpose exists. And like I said, there are specific enemies where it's very helpful to have. Instead, what I'll usually do is, I'll usually go for Ascension, and then at this point, it really depends on what items I have with me at the time. If I've got some lightning damage with my fire damage increase, I'll use Stormbox. This is rare. Maybe I don't feel like necessarily using Deadly Aim. Maybe I'll go for Inquisitor Seal, right? My last 3 points, I'll either put into Deadly Aim for kicks, or I'll increase my attributes here. This is a very common thing that I do with a two-handed ranged weapon for Paladin. This is pretty common. But Ascension is just basically there for when enemies do get into melee range. You've got this as a response. It really helps you survive. It really helps you get them off of you. Very useful. But that's generally how I'll run this. Alright, so that's how I play two-handed ranged. Now, there is a bit more of a difference, actually. I'm just going to go ahead and exemplify this here, where I will be showing you how I play a bit of an unusual build. Now, not a lot of people are strong believers in the infamous pistol with shield. I know there are some huge fans of it out there, but logically speaking, you're already ranged, so what do you need a shield for, right? That's the general line of thought, which is understandable. But for Paladin, there's actually a really fantastic Aegis of Men here. Now, the reason why Aegis of Men here is so nice for range is because you can open up with this, and this stuns enemies. So it's basically a more reliable Rune of Callistor, really, especially since it actually has a longer stun. It stuns for 3 seconds rather than 2. Now, I want to make a very specific distinction here. The two-handed ranged build, I'll play with either by myself or I'll play with friends and family, right? The two-handed range that I just showed you, that can be used in pretty much any situation. If you want to splash in Inquisitor Seal over Ascension with the two-handed weapon for your allies' sake, that's fine. If you want to splash instead, if you want to use Guardian of Empyrean to help your allies, that's fine. If you want to splash in Word of Pain, that's fine. I only use Word of Pain with allies, by the way. I don't use, at least with Paladin, I never build Word of Pain unless I'm playing with friends and they do the right damage types. I do not ever build it otherwise, and even then I very rarely build it. I just thought I'd throw that out there. It just doesn't help you in enough meaningful ways to really be useful to a Paladin. It does fire and cold damage, sure, and then later on it gets lightning damage, which is nice, but ultimately at the end of the day, you're doing physical and fire damage as your two primary damage types. Yes, there is pierce damage you're boosting, but it's minimal compared to the other two damage types, which are your primaries. So it just doesn't offer you enough benefit for a Paladin, so I only exclusively use that in a Paladin class with allies. But back to the main point, this is a more consistent stun, but I'll never use the pistol shield combo with allies, just because this taunts. Now, when you're playing with friends or family, and you're the ranged, you can bet your bottom dollar somebody else is trying to be the tank, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to be a successful range, right? So when I'm playing this particular class, and I am using the pistol shield, throwing the Aegis of Men here will pull enemies away from your tank, which is not what you want to do. But in single player, you're the only target most of the time anyways, if not all the time. It really depends on if there's AI allies wandering around. But I would say 98% of the time, you're the primary target. So it doesn't matter if you taunt the enemy at all. You're using this for the stun. The taunt is just automatic because you're the only target there. So that doesn't matter. So that's ultimately what I use this for, really. This is a single player only type build that I use. And another benefit of using the shield is that you can actually use Safeguard. And even though your melee... not melee, even though you're ranged, it's still boosting your armor, it's still boosting your damage, because it doesn't actually, it's a shield bonus, but it's not necessarily triggering, because it's not like Smite, where you have to have the shield, you know what I'm saying? It still is boosting your damage here. So that is a nice little boost to the damage output of Righteous Fervor. It still is not as much damage as the two-handed ranged, obviously, and you still have 9 points left over. What you want to do with those is up to you. You could also pull out Resilience if you really wanted to. Resilience is a little less useful with the shield because obviously you're blocking some stuff. You could use Presence of Virtue, although I don't usually use that with the ranged. You could go up the Vigor if you really want to. You could use Deadly Aim. It's totally up to you. You might even go into Inquisitor's Seal instead. That would also be perfectly fine. How you want to spend your last few points is entirely up to you. But I find this very effective in a single-player scenario. We don't actually have the ability to use this, because we don't have two-handed range anymore. But I find that very useful as well. Now you'll notice, and I'm actually going to address this now before I get on to the next build, you'll notice I haven't talked about Flames of Ignifar, despite the fact that Flames of Ignifar is in fact fire damage. It's also lightning damage. But you'll notice I haven't really talked about it. And I'm going to demonstrate a really great example of why, once I'm done talking about it, but it's too expensive in terms of both points and energy. It's a horrifically expensive skill, and while I do enjoy the damage output, the fact of the matter is, with the Paladin, there's a better alternative to that kind of consistent damage output, and that particular skill is Eye of Reckoning. Alright? Now, when I'm running an Eye of Reckoning improv build, I'm actually not looking to go into Divine Mandate. I'm looking to go into Aura of Conviction. And the reason why is because Eye of Reckoning, with the Soul, what is that, the Soulfire, also does lightning damage. Yes, there's physical damage, but it's also a lot of fire damage as well. And if you equip a two-handed fire weapon, or a two-handed lightning weapon, you would do even more elemental damage. And this is usually what I'll use. I'll usually play this with a two-handed melee weapon. This is usually how I play two-handed melee when I improv this. But you want Aura of Censure, is that Aura of Censure? No, yeah, that's Aura of Censure. Conviction's the Pierce. And then Judgment. Now, Judgment is interesting, and I'll demonstrate to you further why in a bit. We also want Presence of Virtue here. This is very specific. Resilience we don't necessarily need. We still want Word of Renewal. I don't know why I removed that. We still want this. And we want Inquisitor's Seal, very specifically. Now, at this particular point, I'm going to hold off on talking about the last 33 points, because this is the core of this improv. So the point here is your Aura of Censure has a 7-meter radius, right? Your Inquisitor's Seal has a 3.8-meter radius. It does damage to enemies, so you want that, but it's a very small radius. Your Judgment has not only the 10-meter area here, but it has a boosted 5.5, so it's a 15.5 radius. This is a huge pull. The idea here, if you haven't quite figured it out yet, is slap down Inquisitor's Seal, Judgment, spin to win until they all die. Rinse and repeat as needed. Now, I usually, but not always, but I usually will go into Deadly Aim here. I'm very fond of Deadly Aim here. Okay? It's just a bunch of bonus damage that you can use. I'll also sometimes go into Horn of Gandar. This is mostly for the reduced damage and the confusion. You've just used Judgment to pull them in. Now you can blast them with the Horn of Gandar and spin to your heart's content. That's very effective as well. You're not really using this for the damage, so the fact that it does pierce damage isn't that important. You're just here for the confusion and the reduced damage. Now, you don't necessarily have to go into these either. There are other options that I've found very effective. I don't usually use runes, even though you can. It just takes too long to set them up. You want to use that energy for spinning. But what I do find rather effective is leveling the Guardians of Empyrean up to 12, level these guys up to 11, and you're getting some physical and elemental resistance down here. Now, obviously you don't have enough points. You could, if you were really desperate, pull out 1 point from Presence of Virtue, put it into the Celestial Presence. You only really need 12 here. I'm not even sure you necessarily need 12 all the way, but I've always done that out of just habit and OCD. But you absolutely can run this. This is also a common thing for me to do, is use Celestial Presence here for the resistance reduction. Now, I usually play this with friends and family. Unlike the Pistol Shield build, this is my usual team build when I'm playing Paladin, because essentially your accumulating all of the enemies in one spot, and any of your allies that have an AoE ability are going to love you. If you're running Celestial Presence, your allies will love you. Now, Celestial Presence with these guys isn't necessarily the only option either. There is another one. You'll remember that I mentioned good old Death Sentence and Word of Pain. Also a great skill. You can absolutely go into this. However you feel like going into that. Totally up to you. Again, you could drop some points out of Soul, Presence of Virtue if you really want. It really depends on your energy regen from items, how much you need this, right? You should have at least some points in this. How much is entirely up to you. It depends on your needs. It depends on your equipment. This number fluctuates, but let's hypothetical out 3 points there. Bring these up to 12 so we can maximize this resistance reduction. This isn't for you, really. This is for your allies. Again, it's optional if you really want to. You could also, like I said earlier, go into Celestial Presence. But this is absolutely monumental. Now, the reason why I prefer Eye of Reckoning over Flames of Ignifar is, first off, it is much less points to max this. It's 28. This is a whole stinking 52 points for the entirety of this. And yes, it's incredibly dangerous and it's incredibly effective. But when you're... Think of it this way. Judgment. Area around you. That is a circular area you're pulling enemies into. While you're standing in a circle, while you're burning everyone in a circle around you. It's a whole bunch of circles. This is right in front of you. This shoots right in front of you. Yes, it does more damage than Eye of Reckoning. Absolutely. I don't think anyone can contest that. But it's hitting far fewer enemies at a time because you have to spin around and actually do your... And if you're spinning with Flames of Ignifar, it'll do some damage to everyone around you, yes, but it's very energy intensive. It's spreading out like individual shots. It's kind of like... Think of it this way. You could either surround yourself with enemies, and you can either slap each of them individually, or you can spin with your arms out. It's kind of the same thing. It's a weird analogy, but that's basically what you're doing when you're using Flames of Ignifar. You're going to each enemy and slapping them in the face one by one. This obviously doesn't work too well. Or, if you're using Eye of Reckoning, you're spinning around with your arms out. Far more effective. But this is my usual go-to multiplayer setup with Paladin. It's incredibly effective, especially if you have allies, because it has so many different ways of reducing the enemy's resistance. It gathers them up for your allies, so your allies don't even have a problem there. You know, they don't even have to worry about the enemies escaping or whatever. And keep in mind, while I personally prefer using this with a two-handed weapon, and that's for Word of Arms with that increased energy regeneration really helps you spin to win forever. You don't need to use a two-handed weapon. You can use this with a single-hand weapon and an offhand or a shield or whatever else you want. I just find it a little bit more effective to utilize with a two-handed weapon. I just find it overall more effective. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is, in fact, the infamous single-hand melee and shield. This should go, obviously, without saying. Now, you actually have... I usually go into two different methods here. Alright? There's actually two different ways you can run this. The first is your pretty standard fire build. You've got your Righteous Fervor, you've got Consecration, you're going for the really tanky... This is usually, by the way, how I'll run a hardcore version of this, if I'm going to go into hardcore. I've done this once in hardcore. How far did I get? I didn't get very far because I'm terrible at hardcore. But it is overall effective. If I, worked at it, I could probably do a lot better with it. But you're really looking for the heavy amount of regular attacks here. How exactly you want to use your ultimate skill is entirely up to you. But I'll run all of these. I'll run the Righteous Fervor, I'll run Safeguard, I'll run all the shield abilities. And at the very least, I'll run Word of Renewal. Now, I'll usually run... No, I don't usually run Deadly Aim with this. The two-handed version can work with Deadly Aim, but obviously you wouldn't have the shield skills up top. I'll usually run Resilience. But at this point, it really depends on how you want to specifically play it. If you want to use Vire's Might, that's fine. If I'm looking to take the Paladin into the Shattered Realm, I'll run Vire's Might. I'll usually max this. You can also use the Aegis of Men here. I don't normally build the Guardian of Empyrean with this, with the single melee and the shield. Sometimes I do, but not a whole lot. Sometimes I'll use Steel Resolve. Again, not terribly often. I'll often use Inquisitor Seal. I'm a huge fan of this, as you could probably tell. Big fan. I use this quite a decent bit. Some, again, occasionally I'll use Horn of Gandar if I really feel the need. It really depends. I also often use Ascension, the first stage here. I use that a lot with this. Again, this is mostly for the protections. I'll always at least put 1 point into Virus Might. I don't necessarily always max it out. Like I said, if I'm going to take the Paladin into the Shattered Realm, I know it's going to be a Shattered Realm farmer. I'll maximize Fire's Might rather than some of these other skills. But if I'm just, goofing around with the Paladin, I'll put 1 point into Fire's Might so I can dash to some ranged enemy and just take them out of the picture. You don't have to necessarily use these. This is just how I usually run it. You could also use Aegis of Men here if you want. That's really effective. It's really great ranged, especially if you don't want to go into Fire's Might. Maybe you drop Ascension and Fire's Might and you go for, at the very least, Avenging Shield so you can hit 5 people. It's not quite so important to use Reprisal. Again, if I'm going to go for Aegis of Men here with this, I'm usually using Reprisal because I like the increased retaliation damage added to attack. It's a great retaliation build. It's a wonderful time. But this isn't the only necessarily way. Oh, I forgot to actually mention, you also can use whatever you want as your ultimate. I usually go for Divine Mandate, just because it works really well with Righteous Fervor, it works really well with Shattering Smash, it works really well with Smite. It's just a fantastic time. I'll usually go into Divine Mandate. But again, this is very flexible. Like I said, I take these 3 skills up here, I take Righteous Fervor, and I take, at the very least, Word of Renewal, and I usually take Inquisitor Seal. And then after that, pretty much it's free real estate to whatever you feel like doing. You don't have to use these. These are kind of just how I like to play. Divine Mandate is usually what I go for, but you could absolutely go into Aura of Censure. All those delicious things. But let's talk about the other way to play this, because there is a whole different way. And I don't recommend playing this way a lot, and I'll explain why in a bit, but we're going to pull all these out. And what we're going to talk about is the ever-glorious Path of the Three Paladin. Now, I said there's another way. There's actually technically 2 different ways to run this, okay? I'm almost always going to run Aegis of Men here. Almost always. Again, I usually am using this with a shield. There's a reason for this. Now, you can either run Righteous Fervor, like this. You're basically running off these 2 skills, Inquisitor Seal, and Word of Renewal, and whatever else, obviously, of course, Path of the Three, and you can run whatever else you want here. Maybe you still want Smite and Safeguard, that'd be fine. I sometimes do that. Maybe you instead just feel like going into Horn of Gandar, however you want to run this, but this is the core of this, right? Or you have a different, bit of a weird option. Not necessarily my favorite option, and I'll explain why in a bit, but it is a lot of fun if you really feel like going into it. But you can absolutely use the Chaos Flames of Ignifar as your primary damage source. And just absolutely go to town on people, right? And at this particular point, you're going to want to put your last few points into Presence of Virtue just for that energy, because you need the energy regeneration at that point. And you can absolutely run this. Now, the reason why I don't recommend this is because this is Chaos and Vitality damage, and you don't really have a whole lot of ways of increasing your Chaos damage with this build. Inherently, you're relying very heavily on equipment for that. And that's the other main problem with a Path of the Three Paladin, is a lot of equipment that boosts Paladin skills tends to do fire or physical damage. There's not a whole lot of things that drop, at least that aren't epics or legendaries. There's not a whole lot of monster and frequency. There's not a whole lot of green items that drop boosting Inquisitor or Oathkeeper skills that increase poison or increase vitality. Very few items. They do happen occasionally, but they're not quite common. Now, there's plenty of items that boost vitality and poison damage, absolutely, but they don't necessarily improve skills for your class. They'll usually increase the skills of another class. Now, if that doesn't bother you, that's fine, but, I mean, if I'm going to be increasing my skills anyways, let's, boost the damage they're doing, right? So it is hard to find good equipment for this class, and this is especially painful for improv, which is why I don't often recommend it. If you have a specific plan going in, you've got items set aside, that's a completely different story. Go for it. But if you're looking to improv this, which is, again, how I often play, this is a very tough time, just finding the equipment. The actual skill setup is fantastic, but it's the equipment you're going to have a really hard time with. So you either have to go in with some idea of what equipment you're going to be equipping, you've got to have some epics and legendaries already set aside that you can grow into as you level, or you can try the really challenging improv of the Poison Paladin, as I like to call it. And again, you don't necessarily have to use Flames of Ignifar. It's my less favorite of the two. But it is interesting. I usually will run Righteous Fervor, because I can just convert that right here into Acid and Vitality. Boom. Path of the Three boosts Acid and Vitality. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. So, it really depends on how you want to roll with this. But those are kind of two different ways you can play a Poison Paladin. That also discusses most of the skills here. I think I've covered all of them. Some honorable mentions. I think I've built Rune of Huggerod once or twice. It's just there's so few things that boost cold damage. Same thing with Chilling Rounds. Every once in a while I'll build Storm Spread with the two-handed ranged. Just because Pierce damage, you know, if I'm going to go with the Pierce version with Aura of Conviction, which is very rare but it does happen, I'll run Storm Spread, but otherwise it's really not going to be worth it. And even then, I'm usually running with it with friends. If I'm going to run Aura of Conviction over Divine Mandate, it's because I'm playing with friends, and I'm trying to boost their physical and pierce damage, you know, and then I'll run, at that point I'll run Horn of Gandar, I'll run Storm Spread. It's a wonderful time, but yeah, you're almost never going to be looking at Chilling Rounds. Again, you could if you're really into the pierce damage and you're running Aura of Conviction, that's totally up to you. I just very rarely do. It's more useful than Rune of Huggerod, generally, in my opinion. Again, you could run this still if you're running the Pierce. You could just go with a really heavy Pierce build and just not care what the elemental damage is. That's a viable option. But then you're mostly pulling out of Inquisitor, and the only thing you're pulling out of Oathkeeper would probably be Resilience and maybe Presence of Virtue if you really need that. I mean, I just am not fond of it myself. I, again, sometimes build Stormbox. I mentioned that earlier. I've never built I've built Artifact Handling once with this class, briefly. I didn't, like, run a whole build with it. I built it up for a little while, played with it for a couple of hours in a day, and it was just like, no, I don't use runes like that with this, that often. So, yeah, that's just not how I roll. I mean, can you? Sure. You absolutely can. Again, you're probably going to be using an Aura of Conviction build with the two-handed ranged, but yes, you can use this with Rune of Callistor and Rune of Huggerod. Yes, absolutely. You can. Is it great? Depends on what items you have, but I've often, again, this goes back to the Poison Paladin, it's pretty hard to find good equipment for that, so I, again, don't recommend this. Just throwing that out there. But with that being said, I think we've covered all the main points here. Yeah, no, we've covered pretty much everything I think we need to cover here. Yes. Alright, well, this went absolutely fantastically. I hit all the points I wanted to make, and yeah, this was great. I hope you enjoyed the slightly new style of class examination. There will be more of these. These will primarily be weekend episodes. You'll probably see one of these go up on a Saturday, and you'll probably see a follow-up video on the next Monday, and you'll see them, you know, end capping the week. Either Monday or Tuesday. So when you watch this video, because I have my last final on Monday night, you'll probably see nothing go up Monday night. You'll probably see Part 2 go up on Tuesday. Is when you'll see this, the Part 2, and then the Part 3 will be next Saturday. So just so you know, but these will be like weekend things, so there'll be about 2 of these a week. I still have more Grim Dawn plans. I'm hoping to be able to work out something specific, a couple of specific things, but you'll definitely be seeing these twice a week, again. So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. If you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And thank you all very much. Thank you for your feedback and recommendations. I do appreciate it. It helps me understand what you want. And I just enjoy this stuff regardless, so it's like whatever for me. But thank you all very much for joining me, and have a absolutely fantastic 24 hours.